Warning: this video contains discussions of sexual assault, rape, abuse, trauma, and the fetishization, that's the word I cannot pronounce for the life of me, of these topics in media. If any of these subjects are triggering or upsetting for you, please prioritize your well-being and feel free to click away. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we get into this commentary, I think it's important to say something up front. I'm a survivor of the kind of abuse we're going to be talking about in this video. This isn't some, detached critique or woke rant for the sake of clout. This is personal. I've lived through it, I've felt the aftermath, and I've had to unlearn a lot of the toxic media I consumed. I also want to address something I know a lot of people, especially AFAB people, experience. When you've been through certain kinds of sexual violence, it can be really hard to consume any kind of erotic content that involves women. Not because you hate women, not because you're misogynistic, but because it's just too easy to put yourself in that position. Even if you're not consciously thinking about it, it can trigger memories or feelings that completely ruin the experience. That's why a lot of AFAB people, myself included, ended up gravitating towards boys love or yaoi. It feels safer, in a way. You can enjoy the smut without immediately projecting yourself into the scenario. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's a completely valid coping mechanism, especially for survivors who are just trying to navigate their triggers. But the problem is when that coping mechanism turns into a blind consumption of content that's absolutely drenched in toxic tropes. When you grow up on stories where assault, coercion, and grooming are treated like romantic tension, it starts to warp up your understanding of what desire and intimacy are supposed to look like. I know that because I used to be that person. I used to eat that content up without thinking about the consequences, but I've grown up. I've healed, or at least I'm healing. And I've learned to look at the media I consume with a critical eye, and that's why I'm here. This isn't about shaming people for what they read or watch, especially if you're someone using boys love or yaoi as a way to avoid triggers. It's about understanding that the content we consume, even the content that brings us comfort, can still be deeply harmful if we don't stop to question the messages it's sending us. That's what this video is about, breaking down how media, especially BookTok, anime, boys love, and OC culture, keep romanticizing sexual violence and why that's so dangerous. Also, another note, I apologize if I offend anyone. I hope that everybody understands the point I'm trying to make. Now, with that being said, let's get on with the video. Also, another thing, sorry, I think I stutter a lot in this video, but yeah, sorry for that. BookTok, for all its influence, has a serious toxicity problem when it comes to romance and dark content. There's this growing obsession with certain tropes, things like enemies to lovers, dark romance, possessive love interest, and even outright non-con or dubcon, being passed off as romantic or sexy. The way people talk about these books, you'd think they're the peak of romance, but in reality, they're just normalizing unhealthy, controlling, and outright abusive dynamics. What makes it worse is a complete lack of critical thinking. BookTok hypes up these books with no discussion about how harmful some of this stuff is. We're talking coercion, stalking, manipulation, all framed as sexy dominance. It's like the old, he's not abusive, he's just possessive because he loves you trope got a social media rebrand. And instead of calling it out, people eat it up because the male leads are hot. This doesn't just stay online, it bleeds into how people view relationships in real life. Teens especially start to think love equals obsession, pain means passion, and boundaries are just obstacles to overcome. It's romanticizing trauma bonding, grooming, and flat-out assault. But because these characters are attractive, it's marketed as dark romance goals. There's no space for acknowledging the real trauma behind these scenarios. It's all about making toxicity hot, and that's a huge problem. Okay, let's talk about boys love, yaoi, and the absolute mess that's in some of these genres. For anyone who isn't familiar, yaoi and boys love are genres focused on male-on-male relationships, typically written by and for female audiences. That's a little weird when you think about it, but it gets so much worse when you realize how much of it revolves around non-consensual or predatory relationships. So many classic yaoi and boys' love stories feature assault, coercion, and grooming, and they frame it as romantic development, whether it's the seam overpowering the uke or entire plots built around blackmailing someone into sex. It's so normalized in the genre to the point where people think it's just part of the boys' love culture. And when fans, especially fujoshis, defend this stuff as just fiction, they completely ignore how it influences real-world views of consent and queer relationships. Fujoshis themselves deserve their own call-out. These are mostly straight women who fetishize gay relationships, reducing them to porn and toxic tropes. They'll actively ignore actual queer stories by queer creators because they'd rather consume fetish content made for their own fantasies. Even when confronted, they hide behind "it's just my preference" or "it's just fiction," like that excuses everything. The result is a fandom space where consent violations are sexy, trauma is titillating, and real queer people feel unwelcome in stories supposedly about them. And it's not just old yaoi. Modern webtoons and manhwa still do this, especially with the rise of dark boys' love. CEO ex-employee, bully ex-victim, even stuff like mafia romances, all drenched in abuse framed as love. And instead of challenging these tropes, fandom romanticizes them just further, writing fanfics and fan art that double down on the fetishization. Okay, let's get into OC culture, because this one hurts on a personal level. There's been a huge rise in creators giving their OC trauma-heavy backstories, which is fine. Trauma can make for deep and complex characters. The problem is when sexual assault and other forms of abuse are thrown in just for shock value, or worse, just to make the characters hotter or edgier. There's this awful trend where an OC's entire personality becomes sexy broken victim. The sexual assault backstory isn't handled with any care. It's just there to make them dark and mysterious. With no actual reflection on the long-term impact trauma has on survivors, it flattens something deeply personal and painful into an aesthetic, an accessory, rather than part of a nuanced character arc. It gets even more uncomfortable when these trauma OCs are sexualized. They'll be drawn in provocative poses, half-dressed with captions like "damaged goods" or "ruined but hot." It's not just tasteless, it turns real trauma into a fetish. Survivors who see this are left wondering if people only care about their pain when it's sexy. It's re-traumatizing and deeply disrespectful. A big part of the problem is a total lack of understanding about what sexual assault does to a person. Creators treat it like a quick tragedy button, something you could just sprinkle in to make your OC tragic and then forget about when it's inconvenient. But real survivors live with the aftermath for years, often for life. It shapes their relationships, their sense of safety, their self-worth. It's not just a dramatic backstory, it's an ongoing reality. If someone wants to write about sexual assault, and they absolutely can when it's done with care, they need to actually research. Talk to survivors if they're comfortable sharing, learn about PTSD, about triggers, about the messy, complicated process of healing. Otherwise, it's just more exploitation, using real-world pain to make an OC seem deep without any of the responsibility that comes with handling these topics. At the end of the day, fiction can go to dark places, but it just has to do so with respect and awareness. Throwing in sexual assault just to make an OC tragic hot or to tick an edgy backstory box is lazy at best, and actively harmful at worst. It's not about censoring stories, it's about respecting the real-life pain behind those stories. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you. Seriously, thank you for listening, for trying to understand, and for sticking with me through a topic that's honestly really hard to talk about. Seeing this type of media, seeing people romanticize and fetishize something that's caused me and so many others so much pain is deeply upsetting. And what makes it worse is how shamelessly it's paraded around online, as if there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying you can't enjoy dark stories or messy characters, but there's a line between exploring trauma and sexual violence thoughtfully and turning it into aesthetic thirst bait or a quirky personality trait for fictional characters. All I'm asking is for people to think critically about the content they consume, and especially for the content they share publicly. Just because something is just fiction doesn't mean it doesn't have real-world impact. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. This is my first ever commentary, and honestly, I was kind of nervous to do this, and I have a feeling I'm going to get a lot of hate from this. Also, I want to apologize for all the stutters and my lisp. If you guys want me to make another commentary about anything specific, you guys feel free to comment anything you'd like me to talk about. Anyways, bye!